Hello again, and welcome back to our sessions on making disciples. Lance Finley is with us again, and in this session we're going to be talking about taking this disciple-making initiative into the places where we live. I think about Moses' instructions and what we know as the Shema. To hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And then it goes into the kind of a practical instruction. Take this with you everywhere you go. Bind it on your foreheads and paint it on your doorposts. And how would you translate that process, that instruction, into our everyday lives in the modern world?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key, and you see it kind of echoed again in the Great Commission with that,
Yeah.
the go and make disciples was really the sense of it was more as you are going. So as you are living your life, as you are doing, make disciples. Whereas we begin to kind of reframe our life, we tend to categorize, well, I've got church and I've got work and I've got family and I've got hobbies, where now it all comes under one banner of God's kingdom. Mm-hmm. And as I'm going about the different activities that I'm involved in, working and family time and all that, how do I go about making disciples in that? How do I keep the kingdom in the forefront, both for me personally in my own journey, but bringing others along, inviting them into that? And so I think there are lots of practical ways we can talk through what does that look like? How do you get at that?
You mentioned in the last session how important it is just to realize the need to be intentional about pursuing that mission.
Right. Yeah, and I think joined with that is that whole relational aspect of that's really, I think, where it happened with Jesus. Again, that we have his teachings; those are important. Those were obviously foundational to the disciples, but in a lot of ways, they didn't. It's funny, they didn't get it. Until and I'm not even sure you can really tell when did the disciples actually get Jesus's point, because all throughout the Gospels you see Peter, Jesus asks, who do people say that I am? And he says, you're the Messiah. And then in the next breath, Jesus starts talking about the cross, and Peter pulls him aside and said, you're talking about this death, you're the Messiah. Well, he didn't get it. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. But it was in that relational piece of day in, day out, they lived with him, they watched his life, they saw the work that he did, that was the convincing piece. I think his teaching made sense later on, but what they saw in his life was the compelling piece. And for us, I think it's the same way, of that intentionality about who am I giving myself to in an intentional way. It's not in a conniving or a manipulative way. We're not talking about, kind of doing the bait and switch with somebody, that I'm going to buddy up with you, because I think we've done some of that in the past that's done more harm than good. Mm-hmm. Of maybe, I don't know what you call it, target evangelism. Well, I see Rob, and I'm going to start spending time with Rob because he needs to know Jesus. But if you cool off or you don't show the promise that I thought you did, I'm going to drop you and move on to the next likely victim. Mm-hmm. I think that does a disservice to this whole thing. That there's something in the value of relationships, that in being God's people, that we don't necessarily have to put an agenda to it of, well, I'm going to relate to you or invest in you until I see a return, and if I don't see a return, I'm going to move on. But that whole idea of being intentional of how is it that I can live my life, manage my time, connect with people with the goal that I walk more closely with Jesus, that I become the person that he wants me to be, and that two, you get that same experience as well, that you're going to move forward on your journey. You're going to take your next step with Jesus, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an important point to realize, especially as our world, our culture, gets more and more skeptical and more resistant to church and to the Christian faith, the thing that Paul wrote about, that not everybody is a harvester.
Right.
Some people plant seeds,
Right.
some people water. We're not really in charge of that process of, what happens with that stuff, but recognizing that it all then plays a part of what God is doing in these people's lives.
Oh, very much so.
As we think about really the whole spectrum of our activities in life, like you had said, under the kingdom of God, there's all the different things that we do. How can we begin to recognize that all of these different components are part of the disciple-making process?
Yeah, and the last session, I think we kind of touched on it, was just sometimes we get a little too programmatic. And,
Yes.
you need, for a train to run, you need tracks to run on. I see programs usually as those tracks that otherwise things just, they're kind of shapeless blobs that never go anywhere. So, but we've kind of tried to define, well, discipleship is the stuff that happens here at church in our programs, so on and so forth. And I think what you see with Jesus in the Gospels, I think what's necessary in life today is really pushing it outside of, there are things that happen here, and that's all good. We do Sunday school, we do worship, that's all good. But it's really out in the field, out in the world, in the place you work, that's really where a lot of the important work that God's going to do is going to happen. And again, I think it's two-phase. I think some of that's your own journey. You're going to learn to trust God in deeper ways. There are things in your character that are weak or lacking, and as you get into situations where those are exposed, the Holy Spirit is there to prompt you that, this is an area that needs developed. This is an area that needs confessed. This is an area you need to grow in if you're going to become the person, you were intended to be. So there's that aspect of it. This is where you're fleshing out your own discipleship and growing. There's also that aspect of this is where you're going to walk alongside others. Some who know Jesus, who follow him, who need others in their lives, investing in them, pouring into them so that they become who they need to be, and then countless others who they have no concept of Jesus. They have no affiliation with him or no allegiance to him. And it's through rubbing shoulders with his people and watching the way we live our lives and the way we serve and the way we love that they're going to come. That's going to be their introduction to the kingdom of God. So I really think, they're just enormous. And we've tended to put a lot of value on, well, church time is, that's the valuable time. What happens out there, isn't as important. And I just don't think that's true anymore. That somehow we have to help folks understand that whatever it is that they're doing vocationally or whatever season of life that they're in, the stay-at-home mom who's with ungrateful little terrorists that always demand more and more and more. That doesn't seem very spiritual, but you're investing in the next generation. That some of the more caring and nurturing aspects of God you'll either model to your children well or you won't. And so those kind of things of really helping people see, in light of God's grand story, where is it that I fit in this season? What is God wanting to do in me? And what's he wanting to do through me?
Yes. Well, since you mentioned the workplace, why don't we begin there as you were talking about the parent modeling to the children? It's probably true with the skeptical person in your workplace that is going to gauge your message by your life.
Right. Yeah, and I think you look at, there are lots of avenues to go, but take a teacher, for instance. There are a lot of folks that are in education. I think that's just one of the most remarkable. When you look at the grand scheme of things and what's going on, over the course of the last 10 years or so, I've been involved in mentoring at a local elementary school, kids that are usually behind in their reading. And through that process have just learned a lot just about education itself, reading, its importance. The way our system is set up is you spend the first 3 years of your education learning to read so that you can spend the rest of your education reading to learn. That's just, that's the way it works. And if you don't get to a certain proficiency, to a third grade reading level, every indicator in life goes south. Sexual choices, drug and alcohol choices, crime, and those kind of things. Poverty. Every indicator, if a child doesn't reach a certain level in reading and is equipped with that skill to learn, their future is often, in jeopardy. And so you take the teacher who's week in and week out with the kids, who in one sense probably feels like this isn't very spiritual. I'm not doing the Lord's work here. Well, I would really push back on that. And again, I would go back to the original picture of what God had intended with Adam and Eve was human flourishing. Not only were they given dominion over the plants and the animals, the created world, but it was really a picture of human flourishing, that they would live fully into what they were capable of living into. And in our society, for that to happen, for people to flourish, to do well, even if you need to spiritualize it, you can't read the Bible. You can't know the story of God if you don't know how to read. If you want to go that angle, that's fine. But you're going to be limited in life in what it is you're able to do if you don't have that basic tool down. To me, that's enormous. Take the teacher who's there week in and week out, giving kids skills, helping them acquire the skills and develop it. I think even recognize the God-given talent and potential that He's given to them, and allow them, walk alongside them and help them to step into that. I think that's a part of God's work. I think that's a part of recognizing we were put here for a purpose, that every human being God intended to with a purpose, with intention, with a plan for their life, or with a potential for them to live into. And that teachers, one aspect of that is simply doing their job well, where kids are able to thrive and grow and develop the skills that they're going to need all throughout life. That's not a throwaway. That's not something that we say, well, you didn't teach them the Bible, so that doesn't count. Now, on top of that, there's all kinds of opportunities to share, that people notice your demeanor and how you handle stressful situations, or how you care about, when a colleague's stressed or going through a rough time, how you seek to serve them or minister to them. They notice those. Those are those kind of, opportunities as well. But just the work in and of itself that I think we've tended to devalue and say, well, that's good, but that's not really that spiritual. I would push back on a little bit and say, developing people seems to be one of the big things that God's about. And you have the opportunity to be involved in that in a big way. And so let's champion that. And what's interesting to me, Rob, is I've seen, and I don't know, there's no scientific research behind this, so this is just my opinion, but it seems like I've noticed that in churches, the school teachers usually aren't connected with Sunday school. As far, the folks that are gifted to teach professionally often don't do it, as a ministry within the church. And oftentimes we've kind of, played that as a bad thing on their part of, you've given all these gifts, why don't you use them for the kingdom? Well, I think maybe we need to turn the tables on that and really release people and value them and say, a part of the work that God's given you to do is to pour into these young lives. That literally, and some of the kids, the school I work with is a challenge school, lots of kids coming out of poverty and tough situations. Oftentimes they may be the only adult in their lives speaking into them, blessing them, encouraging them. Why wouldn't we value that? And why don't we see that God's using that in an important way? And a part of His kingdom work of reconciling all things. And one of the passages that haunts me in relation to all of this is in Isaiah 65, which is a picture of the kingdom realized. Jesus comes back and makes everything right. And there's a a verse there that says they won't toil in vain. Their work won't amount to nothing in the end, nor will they bear children doomed to misfortune. And it's that line that, in our world today, there are millions and millions of children that are doomed to misfortune. Some of them are born in places where they have no access to clean water or nutrition or food or medicine that we just take for granted. There are places in the world where diarrhea will kill you, where for us it's just an embarrassing inconvenience. Mm-hmm. They're doomed to misfortune. They're not going to live to be adults. They're not going to experience the life that maybe was supposed to be. There are kids that grow up in neighborhoods where they're not going to acquire the skills for life they need, and in turn, as they grow to be adults, usually be a drain on the system. They'll be in prison or incarcerated or on welfare. There are those folks that people tend to look at that say, you're just baggage here, you're not contributing. Mm-hmm. There are kids that are born into situations where wars going on in their country and their life may be taken. There are millions of kids doomed to misfortune, and that's not the way God intended it to be. And so to release our people, folks like teachers who are working with children, some of whom are doomed to misfortune unless people who love God and intervene into their lives play a role in maybe changing that picture. And so that's just one aspect of it. You could pick, I think, any number, and really, like I said, I think finding that thing in the work that you do, I think is important to realize that this is in the grand scheme of what God's up to in the world. I marvel at the fact, the story of God, you have the garden. The story begins in the garden, ends in a city. That God, there's something about building things that, we start very primitively and kind of rural and rustic, but we end up in a city. And I marvel at our transportation system. That today, after this is done, I'll drive 300 or 400 miles to something else I have to go to. And you look at the interchanges on interstates, and I wouldn't know where to start in laying that out. That doesn't make sense to me. But there are folks, I have a good friend that's what he does for a living. And it allows people to move and to function and to get to the places they're going. And yeah, at first glance, it's like, well, that's not a very spiritual thing. I mean, you're moving dirt, you're making concrete, but there's something in that of making things good that I think reflects the image of God. And helping people to understand that you could get goofy with it, and I think come up with a lot of weird stuff in that. But I really think there is something to valuing what it is people do vocationally and understanding that it's probably closer to the heart of God than they realize, that it's reflective of who He is and His nature and His character. And rather than make them feel bad that they weren't called to do the special work of the missionary or the pastor, we're releasing them to do the work that God intended them to be. And in doing that, and again, going back to kind of this old theme of that's where the people are. The people, fewer and fewer, are coming to us in the church. That we tend to live in this mindset of we just have to pull off the right service where folks will come and hear a compelling argument and come to know Jesus. They're coming less and less. That's going to work less and less because the numbers it attracts are just fewer. But the numbers out there are not only the same, but they're growing. And so why wouldn't we want God's people scattered in every segment of society, living life, growing in Him, and inviting others into their life to say, come and watch, me and what I do, and let the Holy Spirit work through that and see what He does.
Yeah, as you were describing the works of our hands, one of the outgrowths of the Protestant Reformation was the recognition that God gave the gifts, right, and that we share in His creativity as we exercise those gifts and make beautiful things out of it. I think we probably understand that better in our play than we do our work nowadays in our culture, which kind of leads me to another segment of our lives. Many of us work too much, but some of us play a lot too, and that's a good thing. And I've heard a lot of church people lament that people aren't in church anymore. They're on the soccer field, they're on the golf course, they're on the, wherever. And I'm inclined to think, well, we should be on the golf course and in the soccer fields and wherever the people are, like you had just said. So how can we begin to envision our play space as a mission field as well?
Yeah, that whole idea of a theology of play, I think, is becoming more and more important. You look at the importance of playfulness just in relationship. I've often thought about the 2 or 3 of the closest people in my lives, the folks that I'm closest to. We're only close because we spent a lot of time just, dinking around, doing whatever. I mean, nothing terribly spiritual or important or significant. We've just spent a lot of time together. And some of that was in, organized playing games or whatever, and some of it's just hanging out, watching TV or talking or whatever. And I think that's important. And some of what I've seen even in studies on youth ministry and in family dynamics is the importance of play in family. That families that don't play together have much more difficult road, more strife between family members, less joy in the family. That there's something about play. And yeah, we live in a society that's a delicate line to walk because we're kind of sports crazy. I mean, I've just entered into that phase where my 6-year-old's playing soccer and thinking I've signed up for 12 more years of this, and of lots of folks that my son's going to be the next LeBron or whomever, and so I think there's that part of it that we need to push back on. But you're right. One of the coolest things I'm just entering into that season of life for myself is the time on the sidelines to interact with parents, some of whom go to church and follow Jesus and love him, and some of whom don't, and just making those connections that I think as Christians we get fairly cocooned very quickly. That all of our relationships become church friends or safe friends. Maybe not our church, but the folks across the street go to the Methodist church and they're okay. But those are the folks we tend to run around with and connect with, where it's hard to be salt and light when you're not out amongst anything different than who you are. And so I think there are opportunities like that. And again, you just look at the need for coaches, of role models, that you've got fatherless kids out there playing sports that they've never seen a good, positive, father figure in their life. That we have men of God that, it may mean, more time on the field than, in a church activity, but they're playing a role. And I think that's where it comes back to that intentionality piece of really understanding, I'm here because I love the sport, I love the competition, I love the exercise, but I also know that God's using this, that this allows me access to people's lives, that it allows them access to my life, and that in that, God's using that for his good and his glory and his intentions. And it's not a clean-cut yes or no. We want to make things simple of, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. I think the future is going to be much more of a wrestling. There's some folks that probably need to pull out of sports more than what they're in now, that they need to withdraw because they're too into it. It's become an idol. It's not a good thing. But there are others that probably need to be released to say, you've got the right intention, and God's using you in this, and we need to release you more so that you're with the people he wants you to be with.
And of course, there's other ways of playing besides sports too. I think of some people being artists, and there's if you're a writer or a reader, there's reading groups and writer circles, and there's some people are crafty. There's all sorts of craft things. There's some people like to hike. There's all sorts of group activities that we can be involved in, as you say, intentionally, not just to enjoy and have an outlet for our own giftedness, but to intentionally put ourselves where other people are, so that we can connect with them.
Very good.
Yeah. Probably one of the biggest areas that, as we think about passing the faith along, is within our own families. And I know in some circles we've kind of picked up the idea that that's the church's job to raise my kids for me. And yet that's not historically or biblically the way it's to be, is it?
No. Yeah, and that's, and I think we're seeing the fruit of that in a lot of ways. That a lot of the research, again, Christian Smith, Kara Powell, Chap Clark, some of the ones that have done some really, I think, significant research in the last few years on what's going on with the kids that are growing up in the church that tend to be walking away from at least their church expression and oftentimes more seriously their faith altogether. Some of that has grown out of, I think we've switched roles. That when you look at the Shema, at Deuteronomy 6, you see that, you're to tell these stories to your children when you lay down, when you rise up. That the parents were at kind of the forefront of that, of being a huge part. But interestingly enough, Deuteronomy 6 wasn't written to just moms and dads. Right. It was written to a community, to the people of Israel. And so you have that communal aspect of it does take a village. It takes more than just mom and dad in passing on their faith. And I think what we've often done in the evangelical world is we've kind of reversed those roles. The church has said, bring us your kids, we'll disciple them. Mom and dad have been glad to do that. And somehow we need to help switch that again, where moms and dads are taking the lead, they're taking the initiative, they realize that the burden's on us. My kid doesn't turn out okay, doesn't love and follow Jesus, it's not, my youth worker's fault. I'm not saying it's a harsh way to say it. It may not be your fault either. Good, godly parents that their kids make their own decisions. But still, the burden for that initiative is on you. And then the church comes around and supports and encourages. And just some really remarkable things in that, even again, when you think about intentionality. Chap Clark, who's the provost at Fuller Seminary, done a lot of research in youth ministry. One of the most compelling things I've seen is in youth ministry, you usually talk about ratios. That if you take a trip, you want one adult to every 5 kids, or one adult for every 7 kids, so they don't burn down the camp and they're properly supervised and all of that. And Chap's begun to flip that and said, what if we would have 5 adults for every kid in our church? And that doesn't mean that every kid needs 5 Sunday school teachers or 5 small group leaders or 5 pastors. But there are 5 adults that are intentionally invested in their life, that they take an interest in them, that they know what school they go to and what grade they're in, and a little bit about their life, and maybe stay in touch. And I know you had a big test this week. How'd that go? I've seen lots of interesting ways. Kerry Newhoff, who's a pastor in Toronto, has done a rite of passage with his sons where they take 5 men, he and his son, as they get to 12, 13, that they select together. And the father goes to the 5 men, and from all walks. One was an uncle, I think, and one was a co-worker of the father's, and another one was somebody from church. It's not just 5 people from mom and dad's small group, but invited them to, I'd like you to spend a day with my son sometime in the course of the next year. And there are 2 things I ask, that you teach him something about life and something about your faith. And you can pick, you can take him to a baseball game, you can have him shadow you at work, you guys can go hiking or fishing or whatever it is that you like to do. But and at the end of that, they came together, all 5, and shared a little bit with one another. The son with the men of, this is what I've learned from you and appreciated. The men got to speak into the son's life. And that doesn't happen very often in our culture. So lots of really cool ways that I've seen that. But again, where mom and dad are kind of taking the lead, saying, we're going to make this a priority. The spiritual development of our kids, the discipleship of our kids, we're going to take the lead on that. And we're blessed to have this community around us that's going to help in lots of ways, whether that's through the children's ministry program or the youth ministry, or in seeking out, in I think significant relationships to say, we'd like you to be a part of our son's life or our daughter's life, and we want them to see people like you, to model, be able to see what it looks like to follow Jesus.
As I think about the different ministries that we already operate. Like you had mentioned, youth ministry. I think that story you just told gives us a little different glimpse into how it can be envisioned differently. And I think it might be helpful to maybe look at the different standard ministries that we have and explore particular ways that we can be more intentional at making sure those ministries make disciples.
Yeah.
So let's maybe start with youth ministry.
Yeah, and I'd say that's one of those ways is both in children's ministry and youth ministries. I mean, they're unique in some aspects, but common in others. And one of the things that I think we should be intentional about is that idea of helping them gain social capital, that we've tended to segment and say, well, the kids go to this corner and the youth go to this corner, and the young singles are over here and the married couples are here and the middle-aged folks are here, and then of course we've got the older folks. That I don't know, there are aspects of that are helpful and good, and it certainly makes things easier. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that some of the time, but I think you also ought to find times where you bring all those folks together. That there's something, young people in the church need the wisdom of folks that have lived a few years, that have made some mistakes, that have some gray hair, that can point them maybe in a different direction. I think older people in the church oftentimes need the dreams and the energy that the younger people bring into the picture. And certainly, even some practical things like, lots of churches struggle with technology, and usually I say, find a 12-year-old. They can fix that for you. We don't know how to do it, but they do. So that's one aspect of it, is not necessarily, again, don't throw away. I don't think you just disband everything you've done. Maybe you continue to do it, but maybe there's some ways that we can begin to bring some things back together with that idea that we want to value that we want to build some connections between our young people and our older folks, so that they can pour into them, that they can invest in them, they model them. And I think that's, I think there's a little bit of a sense where we live, when Paul says, it's in 1 Corinthians, chapter 6, I believe, where he talks about imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's been a throwaway verse for me a lot of times, or the way it was taught was, well, if you're the Apostle Paul, you can say imitate me, but who of us are the Apostle Paul, so good luck. And I think there's a sense of, what do I have to pass on? That I talked to lots of folks, and I approached a gentleman in my church who's about 20 years older than me, who's an accomplished professional, done very well in his career. And I said, I'd like to spend some time with you, and I think there's some things you could teach me. And he was flabbergasted. And some of that, I'm a pastor, so, I have all the wisdom, I don't actually believe that, and no one else should either. But he was really struck by that. And he said, well, I'm not sure what I would have to pass on to you and what I could teach you. And I'm like, well, you've been married for 40 years and you've raised 2 sons that are productive members of society, and you've done well in your career and seem to have some wisdom. I think I could learn a lot from that. But I think that's one of the hurdles of helping people get over, is just that sense of, you're not a perfect example. When you invite someone into your life to learn from you, to watch how you follow Jesus and live out your faith, but you are a living example. And I think that's an important, somehow we've got the idea that somehow you have to be perfect. I don't think Paul was perfect when he invited others to imitate me as I imitate Christ. But you are a living example. You're flesh and blood. You're something that someone can look at. How do you handle it as a Christian when you face adversity, when the bottom of your world falls out? What does that, to watch somebody walk through that is painful, but it's helpful to see that example lived out. And so I think that's one aspect of it, is creating a culture where we begin to believe that, I'm not perfect, and there are lots of areas where God's still working on me, but there's some things I have to pass on to someone else, that there are ways that I should be investing in others for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom. And so I think that's one aspect of it. Creating just space so that adults and young people connect together, and thinking youth ministry and children's ministry again of, I love that idea of parents and kids being real intentional about who are 5 or 6 people that we want involved in our children's lives because of what we see in them, that we want modeled and emulated. And I know this week I have a friend that's served in various missions throughout the world, usually in really hard, scary places that no one wants to go to. And while he's in town this week, I hope to get him around my kids, because that's one of the pictures of success I want in front of them. That success for us doesn't necessarily mean what we have or accumulate or acquire. That's all good, and but here's somebody that really follows Jesus and has done some remarkable things in the kingdom, and I want to keep that in front of them, as this is somebody Dad admires and Dad wants to have in your life, and those kind of things. And again, a lot of this is the relational aspect of how do we connect generations so that we're passing on the faith, and it's a mutual benefit, again, that I think the older generation has some things to learn from younger folks as well, but that intentionality of creating an environment where we're picking out who are the 4 or 5 people that are 20 years younger than me that I'm going to invest in, that I'm going to be intentional about spending time with, inviting them into my life, inviting them into my family, so that they might see how it is I follow Christ, that might be helpful in their own walk.
Yeah. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about the reverse. And oftentimes, and I've been guilty of this in my own life, of looking to somebody as an example, and then when I see failure or flaws in them, basically discounting them as an example. And I had the privilege of being around one man who was very open about his failures. He had been raised in a context in which missionaries were the ideal. And so he went out as a missionary and was a royal failure, and had to come home with his tail between his legs, only to find out that that was part of the process that the Lord was using in him and in that whole institution that he was a part of. Wow. And so I guess as I'm thinking about that, just realizing that our biblical examples are the same. Abraham wasn't perfect. Moses wasn't perfect. David wasn't perfect. Paul wasn't perfect. Peter wasn't perfect. And yet, the Lord was very strongly at work in them. And that failure and recovery and growth process is really what discipleship is all about.
And to be in a community where that becomes normal rather than stigmatized.
Right.
That we aren't disheartened, or because I've done the same thing. That's somebody I'd like to get to know, that I think would pass things on, and then you see some of the warts and you think maybe not. That to realize we all have our own warts that are unattractive, and we're all working at this together. The Holy Spirit's at work in all of us to make us into the people that He desires us to be. And one of the ways He does that is by putting us in relationships so we can learn from one another and challenge one another and encourage one another, and be there to pick one another up when it does all fall apart and isn't good.
Well, to kind of begin to pull this together in a focal point of discipleship, a lot of what the churches at least suppose themselves to be about is making Christ known to the world, and making disciples, making Christians. And yet I think there's some ambiguity about what that looks like and what sort of scorecard we keep. Just to kind of clarify, what is it in discipleship that we want to accomplish? And how do we go about measuring whether we're succeeding in that process?
Well, it'll sound a little bit like a Sunday school answer, but I don't think it is. I think Jesus is the goal. We want people with the character and competency of Jesus, who look like Him, who have the relationship with the Father like He had. That was His prayer for His disciples in John 17, that we would be connected with the Father the way he was connected with the Father. That we would be one as the church the way he and the Father are one. And so I think Jesus is our goal in having people whose lives look and feel and taste and touch, the way Jesus's did. And you see Jesus giving himself fully to God's designs for his life, even though it wasn't easy, even though it wasn't even what he naturally wanted or leaned towards. He submitted himself to the Father. He was obedient to him. And I think that's the goal for us. Are people looking more and more like Jesus, which I think is, finding your true self, of, who it is you were designed to be, I think looks an awful lot like Jesus, actually, in the end. And so for me, that's the measurement of discipleship. Are people looking and acting like Jesus, embodying his character and his work? Are they doing the things that Jesus did as far as the kingdom, of being, agents of reconciliation, agents of God's kingdom, of healing and restoration taking place, those sorts of things.
I think of the feeding of the 5,000 where Jesus is teaching, obviously, and his disciples come up and say, everybody's getting hungry. Mm-hmm. We really need to feed them. And Jesus said, well, give them something to eat. Uh-huh. And they're like, oh, well, we can't do that. We don't have that kind of money. We don't know what to feed them. And he said, well, bring them to me. Yeah. And I think about my own flaws. I think about my own insecurities. And I think if folks are my disciples, they're going to have my own flaws, my own insecurities, and they're not going to end up looking like Jesus. And yet, as we bring them to Jesus, and we claim the truth that he revealed to us, that he is not only able, but he is faithful to finish the good work that he's begun in them. It sounds like another Sunday school answer, I guess, as I say it, but the reality is God's in the business. He's on a mission. Mm-hmm. And his mission is to seek and to save that which is lost. And I think back to your 4 things that you mentioned in the last session. He made us good in the beginning. He knows the heights from which we have fallen, and yet he laid down his own life, took it up again, and has been at work ever since to redeem and to restore us to that height. Yes. So, is there maybe a challenge that you would like to leave us with?
I think the big one would be for each of us to ask, who is it that I'm pouring my life into for the sake of the kingdom and for Christ? And for some of us, if we'd start with our own family, that is always a struggle. How do you pass? Your family knows you warts and all. They see the things that no one else gets to see. But for some of us, that might be the starting point of how do I begin. I'm not going to farm it out to the church and say, well, that's the children's director job or the youth director's job. No, it's my job to pass on the faith. So how do you begin to do that? For others of us, it may be, who are the people that God's put in my life? Part of the purpose he's put them in my life is for me to say, come and imitate me as I imitate Christ. Let me invest in you, show you what I understand and embody in following Jesus and living the life that he's called me to live, so that you might do that in your life as well. And just to, do an honest evaluation of who is it that I'm doing that in an intentional way, in a regular way, and if I'm not doing it, begin asking God, send me someone, or open my eyes to who's already right in front of me that you want me to go alongside and make a disciple.
My hunch is that these conversations are going to resonate with some folks, and so maybe to end our session today, would you be willing to lead us in a prayer toward that end,
Sure.
that the Lord would
Sure.
really guide us in that process?
Sure, let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your love for us and the grace and mercy that you show us so freely. And we only understand this, Father, because you're a missionary God who's reached out to us when we were lost and far from you. You did not wait for us to come to you, but you sent your Son and came to us. And anything that we know about you and of you, Father, comes from your work in revealing through the Spirit. And so we're grateful for that, and we acknowledge that. And Father, I just pray for my brothers and sisters that are watching this, and pray for myself and for Rob as well.
Yes.
That, Father, you would help us to live lives that are intentionally focused upon your kingdom, upon doing the things that you've told us to do. And one of those things, Father, is to go and make disciples, to live alongside folks who might see and witness in our lives how it is that we follow you, that might hear us proclaim you and the good work that you do, who might come to experience that in their own lives. And so, Father, I pray for each one of us that you would just help us to take an honest look at who is it in our lives that we're discipling. Who is it that you've placed before us, at least in part for the intention of inviting them to have access to our lives, access to us, to watch us follow you, so that they might learn from that example, and not only do the same, but do even more than that, Father. And so, and Father, for those of us that maybe can't name anyone like that, can't identify anyone like that, I pray that you would just, right now, through the power of the Spirit, begin to reveal to us who those folks are that you've put within our circle of influence, that you've put within the orbits of our life, that we might begin to live intentionally, to follow you, to do the things you asked us to do, not only for our good, Father, but for the good of those that you are calling to yourself. And we pray this now in Jesus' name, the name that's above every name. Amen.
Well, thank you very much for being with us, Leon.
Thanks for having me.